She was looking for someone to capture her story. What she found was a man who couldn't even read it, but somehow became the most sought-after writer in New York. Victoria Sterling was everything corporate America worshipped: sharp, ruthless, and brilliant. At 42, she stood 5'8" in designer heels, with platinum blonde hair pulled into a perfect chignon and steel gray eyes that could cut through boardroom nonsense in seconds. As CEO of Sterling Dynamics, a tech empire worth $12 billion, she climbed from a trailer park in Alabama to the top of Manhattan's skyline through sheer determination and an almost frightening work ethic. Victoria had broken glass ceilings, destroyed her competition, and built an empire that employed over 50,000 people worldwide. But success had come at a price. 3 failed marriages, estranged children who saw her more on magazine covers than at dinner tables, and a reputation so intimidating that most people were afraid to tell her the truth about anything. Now, as she approached the 20th anniversary of founding her company, Victoria wanted to tell her story. The real story, not the sanitized version her PR team had been peddling for years. Enter Tommy Moreau, a 45-year-old janitor at Sterling Dynamics headquarters who had worked the night shift for 8 years. Tommy was built like a linebacker, with callous hands and kind brown eyes that crinkled when he smiled. His graying hair was always slightly messy, and he wore the same worn work boots every day. Tommy had a gentle Louisiana drawl and an easy laugh that could brighten the darkest corners of the sterile corporate building. What nobody knew, not his supervisor, not his co-workers, not even his own daughter, was that Tommy couldn't read or write beyond recognizing his own name and a few basic words. He dropped out of school at 14 to help support his family after Hurricane Katrina destroyed their home, and he'd spent his entire adult life carefully hiding his illiteracy behind a friendly smile and careful observation. The unlikely meeting happened on a rainy Thursday night in October. Victoria was working late again, staying until nearly midnight to review quarterly reports, when she decided to walk through the empty offices to clear her head. She'd done this before. Sometimes seeing her empire after hours helped her think. That's when she spotted Tommy in her executive suite, carefully dusting the framed photos on her bookshelf. "You're new," she said, startling him. Tommy turned, nearly dropping his cleaning cloth. "Oh, Miss Sterling, I'm sorry. I didn't know you were still here. I can come back." "No, it's fine. I said you're new. I haven't seen you before." Tommy shifted nervously. "Actually, ma'am, I've been cleaning your office for about 6 years now. We just never crossed paths." Victoria studied him with the same intensity she brought to billion-dollar negotiations. There was something about Tommy that intrigued her. Maybe it was the way he looked directly at her without the usual fear or calculation she saw in most people's eyes. "Tell me something," she said impulsively. "What do you think when you clean this office? What do you see?" Tommy paused, considering the question seriously. "Well, ma'am, I see someone who works too hard. Someone who stays here long after everyone else goes home to their families. I see a lot of awards and pictures, but..." He hesitated. "But what?" "But I don't see any pictures of you smiling. Not really smiling, anyway." That conversation haunted Victoria for weeks. She found herself timing her late nights to coincide with Tommy's cleaning schedule, and their brief exchanges became the highlight of her increasingly isolated days. Tommy had a way of listening, really listening, that she hadn't experienced in years. He asked questions that cut straight to the heart of things, unencumbered by corporate jargon or hidden agendas. One evening, as Victoria complained about the team of ghostwriters she'd been interviewing for her autobiography, Tommy made an offhand comment that changed everything. "Maybe you need someone who doesn't know how the story is supposed to end," he said while emptying her wastebasket. "What do you mean?" "Well, all them writers probably know your story already, right? They've read the articles, seen the interviews. Maybe you need someone who can hear it fresh, like it's the first time anyone's telling it." The idea was absurd, completely ridiculous, and yet something about it appealed to Victoria's contrarian nature. She'd built her empire by doing things others said couldn't be done. "Why not this?" "Tommy," she said suddenly, "how would you like to write my autobiography?" Tommy's eyes widened. "Ma'am, I think you might be more tired than you realize." But Victoria was already warming to the idea. "I'm serious. I'll pay you more in 6 months than you make in 5 years. All you have to do is listen to my story and help me tell it." What Victoria didn't know was that she just offered a dream job to a man who couldn't read the contract she'd eventually asked him to sign. Tommy's panic was immediate and overwhelming. He'd spent decades carefully avoiding situations that would expose his illiteracy, and now the most powerful woman in the building wanted him to write a book. But the money she mentioned would change his daughter's life, could pay for her college, get them out of their cramped apartment, give her opportunities he'd never had. So Tommy did what he'd always done when faced with impossible situations. He improvised. "I'd be honored, Miss Sterling," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Over the next 3 months, Victoria and Tommy met every evening after the offices emptied. Victoria would tell her stories about growing up poor, about the teachers who told her she'd never amount to anything, about the first time she walked into a boardroom full of men who immediately underestimated her. Tommy would listen with an intensity that made Victoria feel truly heard for the first time in decades. But Tommy's real genius wasn't in writing. It was in understanding people. He asked the questions that unlocked Victoria's most guarded memories. He pushed her to explain not just what happened, but how it felt. And when Victoria tried to sanitize her story or make herself sound more heroic, Tommy would gently call her out. "That doesn't sound like the whole truth," he'd say in his gentle drawl. "What ain't you telling me?" What Victoria didn't realize was that Tommy was secretly recording their sessions on an old smartphone his daughter had taught him to use. Every night, he would take the recordings to Maria Santos, a freelance journalist who cleaned offices in the same building. Maria, a former reporter who'd lost her job in media cutbacks, needed the money Tommy offered to transcribe their conversations. She thought she was just doing transcription work. She had no idea she was crafting what would become the most honest, raw, and compelling autobiography of the decade. Tommy's illiteracy became his superpower. Because he couldn't write in the flowery, corporate language that most ghostwriters used, the story that emerged in Maria's transcriptions was told in Victoria's authentic voice, direct, unflinching, and brutally honest. Tommy's questions, unfiltered by literary pretension or business school vocabulary, cut straight to the emotional core of Victoria's experiences. The turning point came when Victoria asked to see the first draft. Tommy's stomach dropped as he realized he'd have to confess everything. But before he could speak, Victoria started reading passages aloud. "Tommy, this is incredible. This doesn't sound like any autobiography I've ever read. It sounds like me actually talking. How did you capture my voice so perfectly?" That's when Tommy broke down and told her the truth about his illiteracy, about Maria, about the recordings and the transcriptions, and his desperate fear that she'd fire him and possibly have him arrested for fraud. Victoria listened in stunned silence. Then, to Tommy's amazement, she started laughing. "You mean to tell me," she said between laughs, "that I hired someone who can't read to write my book, and it's the best thing I've ever read about myself?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm real sorry I lied to you." Victoria's expression grew serious. "Tommy, you didn't lie to me. You gave me exactly what I asked for, someone who could hear my story fresh. The fact that you couldn't read the articles about me, couldn't be influenced by other people's opinions about who I am or what my story should sound like, that's exactly what made this work." When Sterling Truth hit bookstores 6 months later, it became an immediate sensation. Publishers had never seen anything like it. A CEO's autobiography that read like an intimate conversation with your most insightful friend. The book topped bestseller lists for months, won several prestigious awards, and established a new standard for authentic business memoirs. But the real transformation was in the unlikely partnership between Victoria and Tommy. Victoria used her influence to get Tommy enrolled in adult literacy classes, and Tommy's daughter received a full scholarship to Columbia University. Tommy eventually became Victoria's head of employee relations, bringing his gift for really listening to people to help improve workplace culture across Sterling dynamics. More importantly, Tommy's approach to storytelling, focusing on emotional truth over polished prose, revolutionized the ghostwriting industry. Publishers began seeking out writers who could capture authentic voices rather than those who could craft beautiful sentences. Tommy became one of the most sought-after collaborators in New York, though he still insisted on recording all his interviews and working with Maria, who became his permanent partner and eventually his wife. The greatest irony was that Tommy's inability to read traditional books made him one of the most effective writers of his generation. He understood that the best stories aren't about perfect grammar or sophisticated vocabulary. They're about human truth, told in a voice that feels real and immediate. Victoria's book opened doors she never expected, not just to new business opportunities, but to relationships with her children, who recognized their mother for the first time in the honest, vulnerable woman they met in those pages. She and Tommy remained close friends, and she credited him with teaching her that sometimes the most profound insights come from the most unexpected sources. Years later, when asked about her decision to hire an illiterate janitor to write her autobiography, Victoria would smile and say, "Sometimes the best way to tell your story is to find someone who can't read anyone else's version of it." Never underestimate the power of a fresh perspective. Sometimes the person who seems least qualified for the job is exactly the person who can see what everyone else has missed. And sometimes the greatest stories are told not by those who know all the words, but by those who understand all the feelings. If you like that story, please subscribe for more. Thank you, and until next time.